Good morning, everybody. Welcome to NEEP's second Ready, Set, Scale webinar. I'm Ara Shur, NEEP's Executive Director. Welcome back from a long weekend. We are very excited for the second webinar in this series. NEEP works with our state, local, utility, industry, and nonprofit partners to advance energy efficiency and decarbonization across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region. And with this Ready, Set, Scale series, we are highlighting the policies and program models, the technologies, and the other solutions that are rapidly developing across our region and the rest of the country, and that are beginning to and are very ready to scale rapidly, moving us across our region quickly towards our equity, climate, and energy efficiency goals. Building performance standards is a great example of this. Since New York City passed the first energy benchmarking law in the nation, policies addressing existing buildings have grown and evolved. They've been popping up everywhere, they're spreading, and they're joining building energy codes in a partnership to manage building energy use and greenhouse gas emissions throughout buildings' entire life cycle. This is critically important. NEEP is based outside of Boston. And in Boston, we have buildings that were built 50, 100, 200 and more years ago. We have civic buildings that hosted George Washington. So managing existing buildings, emissions and energy use across the Northeast, across the Mid-Atlantic, and across the whole country is critically important. You may have seen that last month, the White House announced a coalition of states, counties, and cities that would work together with support from the DOE and EPA to scale building performance standards. Of the 31 cities and counties, 10 of them are in New England or Mid-Atlantic region, including Boston and Washington, D.C., two leading cities that have developed building performance standards and are addressing how those regulations work with energy codes and are here to speak about that today. We also have a representative from the DOE who's here to speak about the national plan for this, and we're really excited about that. So without further ado, let me welcome NEEP's Building Policy Manager, Cornelia Wu. Hi, Cornelia.
Hello, how are you, Ara?
I'm good. We have, we're kind of epitome of this tension because you're an architect and I come from real estate development and management. So, I know you only care about the building when it's built and I have to put up with the buildings once they're in operation. So I'm really happy to see us working together to look at the whole building life cycle in this webinar.
Yes, I think it's so important that our building performance standards and our energy codes are aligned to produce buildings that are much more energy efficient when they're built and as they keep aging into our building stock.
Yeah, our very established building stock as we have here in New England, and you're in New York, and also have anybody who says a building life cycle is 20 years is not traveling around our region. All right, I'll leave you to it. Thanks, Cornelia.
Okay.
Bye.
So I'm Cornelia Wu. I'm a building policy manager at NEEP, and I'm part of the codes and standards team. Just going to get started here with thank you to our funders and allies. Some things to note first, this webinar is being recorded. In order to improve accessibility, we have enabled the closed captioning, but you do have the ability to disable this feature in the lower right corner of your Zoom screen. The slides and recording will be sent to everyone, and all lines will be on mute. Please do type any questions in the chat. The chat will be available for comments, discussion, and collaboration, and we will have a question and answer period at the end of this session. Our series sponsor for our Ready, Set, Scale is Connecticut Energy Environment, DEEP, and thank you so much. We also would not be able to do this without our funders. You can see them here on the screen, and our allies as well. We are so grateful for your partnership. And here is a list of our state partners. These are the states within our 13 jurisdictions in the NEEP region, and it is so important for all of us to keep in touch with each other and see what the different states are doing. So why are building performance standards important? The buildings in the US account for 39% of energy use. They also account for 31% of US greenhouse gas emissions. So clearly, buildings have a lot to do with the energy consumption in this country. Now, by 2050, about 44% of the commercial buildings and 67% of residential buildings will have been built in 2019 or earlier. Only a handful of cities or states to date have implemented building performance standards. So what we see from these statistics is the current rate of retrofit is just too slow. We need to increase the rate of building retrofits drastically, and this can be accomplished with building performance standards. Cities and states across the US have made commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So aligning a building performance standard with decarbonization objectives is one way to make sure a jurisdiction can meet its climate goals. Next slide, please. Energy codes apply to new buildings and major renovations. They are based on the International Energy Conservation Code and/or ANSI/ASHRAE IES 90.1. Now, energy codes are one of many building codes, such as fire codes, structural codes, plumbing, and electrical codes. Energy codes are set by each state, and while typically based on the International Energy Conservation Code, the model code year can vary. There are three major components: lighting, HVAC or mechanical, and envelope. Now, in contrast, building performance standards are relatively new and they apply to existing buildings, usually for buildings that exceed a certain square footage. They are policies that require building owners to meet city or state mandated targets by improving the performance of their building, all of which can include energy use, water use, and emissions within the timeline specified, usually a series of milestones that will need to be met over the years. For instance, a compliance cycle might be every 5 years. Many buildings, as you know, combust fossil fuels on site for heat and hot water purposes. Building performance standards can encourage better performing buildings without necessarily stipulating the exact path. Jurisdictions in the US where building performance standard legislation has been enacted include Washington, DC, New York City, Washington State, St. Louis, Missouri, and Reno, Nevada. Energy codes and building performance standards are often developed independently of each other, and this is the crux of our session today. This is because while the energy code is typically based on the IECC, building performance standards are developed by each jurisdiction based on different interpretations of how benchmarking should be achieved and other variations. Next slide, please. Now, the model codes are related to a federal building performance standards, but states and municipalities create them. So let's talk about equity for a moment. Building performance standards puts a new obligation on building owners. In the past, they were typically exempt from catching up with new codes. Now, to be clear, in jurisdictions with building performance standards, building owners do not have to meet the current IECC standard for new construction, but the exemptions that they're likely accustomed to are not in place when it comes to building performance standards, since the very purpose of them is to regulate existing buildings. Therefore, equity and affordability are important. Education and technical assistance and financial assistance should be offered to building owners and managers. Training should be provided to students and contractors to create a diverse workforce, and information should be provided to building occupants. Jurisdictions need to listen to those groups directly affected by the building performance standards and to understand the needs of underserved groups. Next slide, please. Now, the nexus of energy codes and building performance standards are what our three speakers will be discussing today. As soon as a new building is built, it becomes an existing building and is subject to building performance standards. However, energy codes and building performance standards, as mentioned, are developed separately and are therefore not always aligned. Building performance standards typically are developed by the individual jurisdiction with both short and long-term goals. They apply to commercial and multifamily buildings typically that exceed a stated square footage. The first step in adoption of a building performance standard is selecting the metrics. These measure whether a given building is using more or less energy than comparable buildings. And there are different metrics that different jurisdictions use. For instance, there's the energy use index, which measures an energy consumption per unit of conditioned floor area. And there's the emissions intensity limits, which measure in metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions per square foot. For instance, New York City uses this metric. A building can be built to meet its jurisdiction's energy code, but it might not be in a good position to meet building performance standards requirements, or at the very least might find the metrics are different. This causes costly and unnecessary retrofits down the line and is a missed opportunity to build more energy efficient buildings from the outset. The speakers we have today will discuss both national and local approaches to this issue. Next slide, please. And with that, I'd like to introduce Harry Bergman from the US Department of Energy. I'm so glad that he can join us today. And hello, Harry, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing well, Cornelia. Thank you. How are you?
Good, I'm doing well. I just want to mention Harry Bergman is a technology manager with the Department of Energy's Building Technologies Office. He supports the agency's efforts around data-driven building energy and emissions programs. He manages the Building Energy Data Sub-Program, and he now leads the department's efforts around building performance standards. So this session is right up his alley. We're so happy to have you here, Harry. I will turn the slides over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Hey, everyone, I'm Harry Bergman. Nice to meet you all, and thank you for having me here today. I'm going to be talking a bit about the National Building Performance Standards Coalition that was announced last month by President Biden, and then some of the national level resources that are going to be coming out of DOE over the next few months and years to help support building performance standards in this sort of emerging moment that we have on our hands. Next slide, please. So this coalition was launched and is a really exciting development from where we stand. It covers 33 state and local governments, as we already heard, but those state and local governments cover nearly 20% of the nation's building footprint and 22% of the population. So we're excited to see that it's very representative, both of the building stock, of the US's geographic diversity and political diversity. And the opportunity to put together building performance standards through legislation or through regulation by Earth Day 2024 is a really ambitious goal. And we're excited to have so many folks committed to that, and we're looking forward to supporting all of them. Next slide, please. So as you can see, there are folks all over the country, cities, states, and counties that are pitching in and joining this BPS coalition. I understand there's a lot of still growing interest in the coalition. And so as we are getting this thing stood up and moving, we're looking forward to seeing this map expand as well. Next slide, please. So the core components of this coalition, we're going to take a few minutes to walk through those, but really it's all founded on technical assistance and support. There is no one-size-fits-all BPS policy. They're all going to look a little bit different by jurisdiction based on the makeup of their building stock, the particular energy or emissions goals that they want to reach. But we want to make sure that interested jurisdictions are not just out there on their own trying to put these things together. So through DOE and the national labs, and of course EPA and their resources, there's a robust technical assistance network through the federal government. And so that can help you set your chosen metric to, underpin your energy or emissions goal. It can also help you set interim targets, the length of your compliance cycles, setting your energy or emissions reduction trajectories, and helping you do all of sort of the math behind this program. We also want to make sure that we are centering equitable outcomes and putting together a stakeholder engagement process that emphasizes that. BPSs need to be useful for all buildings above whatever that square footage threshold may be. A big part of that is small and medium commercial, is multifamily, especially affordable housing, historically underserved communities that are going to be required to meet the goals under these BPSs need additional resources and support and training and engagement. And we need to make sure that the implementing jurisdictions have access to understanding what that is. And so we're working with folks to put together best practices around stakeholder engagement, making sure we understand who needs to be at the table and how we need to be thinking about not just building performance standards, but sort of the companion policies that should come along with building performance standards in order to drive equitable outcomes for the whole cross section of the built environment. A big portion of this is also workforce development, job creation. The rate at which we're currently intervening in buildings in order to improve performance and reduce emissions is far too slow. We need to get more boots on the ground, more technology deployment, and a big part of that is jobs and job training and making sure that these jobs are well-paid, place-based, supporting the communities that they're in. So that's going to be a big part of this coalition as well. And we want to go even further and leverage existing efforts like the Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grants and DOE's State Energy Program. These are, I think, great success stories from the agency and are good channels for getting funding out to agencies like state and local governments that are trying to implement energy efficiency and emissions reduction programs. So we want to make sure that we aren't just doing all of this BPS work in a vacuum, but that we're leveraging existing resources and sort of proven success strategies. And then beyond all of that, we're building all of this technical assistance resource network through the federal government. We want to make sure that we're also embedding the expertise that we need on equity and environmental justice into the national labs. We know that we are not necessarily the leaders there now, but we want to make sure that we are building out that capability so we're able to provide that sort of support and guidance and expertise in the future. Next slide, please. So DOE's role in particular, I think it's going to feel, for those of you in the codes community, it's going to feel pretty similar to what we do for existing technical assistance efforts for state governments, looking at building energy codes. All of our BPS work at the moment exists within the Building Energy Codes program, within the Building Technologies Office. But the goal here is really that we want all of these analyses to be scalable and to be replicable. That means, you know, instead of working with codes where there are 50 state governments, a handful of local governments looking at implementation and adoption, anyone that's interested, whether it's a state or a city or a county, can be looking at building performance standards. And we need to make sure that the analysis that we're doing for you all is both accurate and precise, but also scalable. It needs to be able to support goal and target setting. It needs to be able to walk you through implementation strategies, understanding compliance. And so that's what we're looking to put together through the Building Codes program today. To start that off, we're looking at putting together a resource library, case studies, linking folks to third parties for implementation support. We know there are a lot of good model policies out there. EPA has a really excellent BPS toolkit, and we want to make sure that we're able to centralize a bunch of these resources in one place. And so that's something that we're looking at getting stood up in the next few weeks here. Next slide, please. So sort of to the crux of this with building performance standards and new construction codes, you know, the big question is, how do we make sure that they're aligned? And I think the thing that comes to mind for me first and foremost is around cost effectiveness. Understanding the cost implications of new construction codes, but then also the way that BPSs are driving interventions in buildings and the technologies required to meet those. Are they all pushing in the same direction? What type of analysis and how do we need to be looking at the building stock in order to determine that? Because what we don't want to do is have an agency or jurisdiction adopt a new construction code or a stretch code and end up with that code somehow being in conflict with sort of the trajectory set by a building performance standard, so that new construction comes online and is then sort of put into a conundrum. We also need to think about prescriptive compliance pathways. If your building comes online and becomes an existing building 18 months before the end of a BPS compliance cycle, does that mean that there's a requirement to meet that target 18 months in? Like, you might be still figuring out, you know, is your building functioning appropriately? And so we need to think about what that threshold is for being covered as a new construction or a deep retrofit, or is there a prescriptive pathway that gets you through sort of an initial compliance period if you're close enough to when that closes out? We also need to make sure that the performance targets are aligned. You know, you have energy codes, but then making sure that energy codes are aligned with BPS emissions targets, making sure that those performance thresholds, if you're backing it out to match energy consumption, are still aligned with your codes, right? And again, don't present conflicts with cost effectiveness. So these are a lot of really big questions that we're thinking about in the codes program here and working on putting pen to paper to get some answers to. But I'm sure these are a lot of similar things that y'all are thinking about as well. But then, you know, more broadly, additional considerations around building performance standards as it relates to new construction and sort of the intersection of new construction and existing buildings is, how does this enable, you know, a truly life cycle based approach to building decarbonization? You know, there's only so much new construction every year. So much of our existing building stock already is going to still be here in 2050. And if we're looking at getting to zero energy or getting to zero carbon, we need to be thinking about buildings throughout their entire life cycle. And we think building performance standards present a really unique opportunity to start doing that. above all, we need to be making sure that we have equitable outcomes under both new construction and existing building policies and programs, and understanding what the companion policies are that get us there. If we're all of a sudden going through and doing interventions on all of these buildings at scale that we haven't seen before, what does that mean for, displacing offices, displacing housing? Are there supportive programs to make sure that folks are able to come back into that building after the intervention takes place? We need to make sure that we're thinking about all of those different things. And then finally, how do you align the benefits of new construction codes and building performance standards with public health metrics, with environmental justice outcomes? If we're seeing improvements in, local air quality, for example, how are we measuring that and then communicating that back out to the community as a benefit from thinking through both new construction and BPS improvements? So again, a lot of big questions, and we're working on putting pen to paper on getting some answers for you all there, and hoping to include that in the resource library that we're going to have going up in a few weeks. With that, I think that's everything I have from the DOE side, and I think I'm able to take a couple of quick clarifying questions. Is that right, or are we going to hold everything till the end?
Actually, I think we're going to hold everything until the end.
Okay.
But if anybody has any questions for Harry, feel free to type them in the chat now. And we'll be next to speaker. Actually, the first speaker will be David Epley. He is with the Department of Energy and Environment in Washington, D.C. Hello, David.
Greetings, Cornelia. Thanks. Nice to see everyone.
Thank you for joining us.
Having us out.
Okay. Yes,
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
We're just so happy to have you here with us, because DC really is at the forefront with building performance standards.
Thank you. Okay, let's get started. So will you all be able to advance the slides, or should I be doing it on my end?
I think we can advance them on our end.
Okay, great. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about BEPS and codes and how I think about it. I spent 7 years running DC's code program, the energy code and green code and stuff. So I have a lot of experience in that world, and thinking about all the different aspects of enforcement and standing up a program and all that type of thing. And then I've been at DOE for 2 years, where our building energy performance standards program is run out of by Katie Bergfeld, who's on the call today as well. Katie's fantastic, and I feel better when I'm in a presentation when Katie is here, because for sure there's going to be a question I can't answer that Katie knows the answer to, like most questions. So Katie is my safety blanket. I'm sure she's finding that a great comparison now. Okay, so BEPS and codes. I want to think about this through the lens of like policy and then program application. So BEPS is an outcome-based standard. And by the way, BEPS for us is BPS for the nation, I guess. We just call it Building Energy Performance Standards. So I want to clarify that. But it's an outcome-based standard for existing building policy, law, and so forth. The energy code, like all codes, is sort of a design and construction standard or regulation, focused on new construction, but also on existing buildings undertaking all aspects and levels of renovation. So understanding the relationship to those and how those relate, kind of like the life cycle, like Harry was saying, I think is really important in terms of how we think about policy, achieving our GHG goals. Also, I think it's really important when you think about enforcement. And these are enforced by different agencies, and they're enforced at different points in time in the lifetime of a building. And that really has, just with the building itself, ownership changes, people responsible change over time. Like all those different things kind of blend into how these kind of work together. And I think that's sort of the practical programmatic aspect of this that I would think about. We're going to talk about some. What I will say is both of these are critical to achieving our short and long-term carbon goals. So next slide, please. Okay, in DC, about 75% of our emissions come from buildings. You can kind of see that represented with the 24% from residential, 19 from institutional government buildings, and then 32 from commercial and industrial buildings. Needless to say, buildings are very important to how we achieve our carbon neutrality by 2050. And so we take our building energy policies and programs and enforcement very seriously. Next slide. Give a few more graphs here. So On the left here, you'll see sort of the GHG emissions trajectories that we have. This is out of our Clean Energy DC plan, which is online, of course. It's like a comprehensive energy plan. So the kind of tan, brown, gold color there is our buildings. And that on the circular chart here on the left, that's represented by our net zero energy new building strategy, and then our existing building strategy, which would be the building energy performance standards. Next slide. To kind of break this down a bit further, and by the way, I'm sure NEEP will send out these slides, so you can dig into these a bit more. But you'll see here, this is going out to 2032. And as it progresses, you'll note that the impact of like the net zero energy codes and like energy efficient codes starts to have a bigger impact as we move forward. And on the chart on the left, you can see by 2032, it's about 4.6% of our GHG reductions over the 2032 business as usual case is 4.6 for new construction policies, i.e. net zero energy codes. And then the existing building policies, our BEPS is 9% at that point in time. Next slide. So BEPS and codes accelerate each other is how we sort of think about it over here. So in this chart here, we see kind of mapping out the 2050s. We're doing some analysis here. The dotted line on the bottom is if we stuck with our current energy code, technically our 2017 energy code, or was introduced in 2017. We only adopted in 2020 though. But if that was the case, that's sort of where we would go. But if we move with our net zero energy codes, what ends up happening, and we'll talk about why this happens in a minute, is that it sort of accelerates the impact of BEPS, because BEPS, each building type, basically we're setting the building energy performance standards based on the median performance, or like, and then buildings that are lower than that, they have to go up. So if you start to sort of push up the performance of every building, or new buildings coming online, it sort of moves the whole pack up and kind of changes the median, and then accelerates, and then kind of builds off of each other as it goes forward. So it's very important to have both these things. And I'll mention too that we would not be able to reach our carbon goals without this BEPS and our net zero energy code. So next slide. Okay, so here we have sort of BEPS cycles, as I mentioned. So there's the way that it works in DC, and I guess this is in New York too, and other places, but BEPS are set for us. We have like a 6-year period, and we have multiple cycles over time. And as we go up, the energy performance continues to become enhanced. So you complete the first cycle, and then you sort of reshuffle the deck, you reset the BEPS, the standards, and then folks below the standards have another 5 years to come above, and then it keeps going on and on. And this is, as mentioned, the code starts to accelerate this as you bring on more efficient buildings into the fold and into the deck. Next slide. One thing I'll mention too is over time, our BEPS starts to step down these are over the cycles I was just pointing out. So right now we're at 50,000 square feet and greater for private buildings. DC owned, or like, our even instrumentality owned buildings are at 10,000 square feet. So that covers a lot of ground there. And then in our second cycle, we're going to go down to 25,000 square feet. And then in BEPS 3, it's going to be down to 10,000. So this starts to change over time too. Of course, the codes affect all construction and all buildings. So next slide. I'll just note, this is sort of like a very rough trajectory of where we're trying to get to with our codes. I actually borrowed this from an old slide. So where it says 2013 code, it says current code. That's actually not true anymore. The 2020 or the 2017 code is the current code. And then 2026 is where we're trying to get to our net zero energy slide. Our net zero energy code, I think maybe the NEEP background is sort of obscuring something that I put in there, but basically there's well, anyways, there's a renewable energy component to that 2026 that kind of gets you to the net zero energy annual line. So we have like 2 code cycles before we're there. We're kind of hurriedly working on the 2023 code, but it's a lot, it's aggressive. So yeah. I'll just again mention this is schematic. These are, representing energy uses are not specific numbers at the moment. Next slide. Okay, so harmonizing these two things. As I mentioned, they accelerate each other. Without them, we wouldn't be able to hit our 2050 goals. One of the things that we've been thinking about a lot is our interagency coordination on policy and enforcement. So like, how do the policies in that zero energy codes or the codes in general, as well as like policies like how we invest in like affordable housing and supplement that, like the requirements, like the mandatory requirements in like a qualified allocation plan, like how do those all sort of like blend into each other to ensure that buildings coming online and building to the codes are going to be able to then comply with BEPS over time. I think one thing that's interesting about this is because there's a BEPS out there in the future, it really changes like the way that owners think about design and construction of buildings. I think we all probably know that there can be challenges with accountability and how buildings are built, designed, and constructed. Code enforcement is a really difficult space, whether there's a plan review, inspections, certificate of occupancy. It's very difficult. When you have BEPS on the like kind of out on the horizon, however, it sort of changes, when you're at plan review and you say, oh, I need you to fix this, I need you to do this, the system you put in here is incorrect. Or like you're out in inspection and you find out that like, okay, you value and engineered this thing out. It changes about like what that means, because down the road, they're going to be accountable for that thing. And then also the whole piece is about ownership and how it changes over time. Everyone from who gets the permit, who develops it, who sells it, and it changes how they think about that. Ideally, so it sort of gives different additional ammunition for the code official as well, which I think is really important. And the other thing I mentioned too is like the way that owners think about this also is sort of kind of based around like cost and risk, which can also kind of synonymous in certain ways. So the way that you think about the codes and the way BEPS and the way you design your building and the investment you make up front has different implications. So I won't belabor that anymore. But okay, let's keep going on the next slide. Oh, I'm at 10 minutes. Okay, all I'm going to say is DC has a lot of resources online, and we put out regulations, put the law beyond, but there's a lot of stuff that we've put out there, and happy to talk to anyone support. Next slide. Next slide. Thanks. Okay. Yeah, there's an affordable housing retrofit accelerator we've stood up with the stimulus funds, the RS stimulus funds. So that's really interesting and something worth checking out. Next slide. And that's me. Oh, and then Katie Bergfeld, I think, yeah, here. But we'll do some Q&A later. But I'll turn it over to the next person.
Hello, David. Well, thank you for all the information. You might have been over, but you gave us a lot of relevant information.
Okay, good.
So we'll see you for the Q&A. And I'll just mention that Katie Bergfeld, who you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, is the Chief of Building Performance and the Enforcement Branch at the DOEE. So you will see both David and Katie in the Q&A. Thanks again, David. Our next speaker is John Delzell. He is Senior Architect for Sustainable Development in the Boston Redevelopment Authority, and he was previously on the Board of Directors of the U.S. Green Building Council. Hello, John.
Good morning, Cornelia. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us.
I'm always so happy to see architects working with existing buildings at scale because it is so important to our climate goals.
It's so important, especially as you opened in a city like Boston, where our buildings date back literally hundreds of years and are very precious to us.
Thank you again. And let's see if we can get your first slide up.
Great. I'm going to share my screen.
Oh, right.
And if you'll just let me know that you can see my slides, I'll be all set.
Okay, I see it.
Great. So I'm actually going to talk about two Boston policies. One is recently enacted, and that is our Building Emission Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance 2.0, or affectionately known as BERDO 2.0, and our Zero Net Carbon Building Zoning initiative that is underway and will soon enact comparable standards for new constructions. As background, we have long had a green building standard. It's Article 37. Our current policy has set in motion a requirement that we update that zoning to include a zero net carbon building standard and lower our applicability threshold to 20,000 square feet, but also include updates to our other aspects of this. It is a LEED-based standard, so we're elevating the minimum requirement to LEED Gold. And very importantly, I'll talk about this, aligning our BERDO standard and our zoning standards so that they interact and work with each other. This really picks up on your point earlier about a new building becomes an existing building the day it opens up. And then corresponding updates to our review processes. What's great in Boston is that we already have an excellent industry at work creating high performance buildings. So we're really quite fortunate. We have some of the best engineers in the country, some of the best architects, but also some of the best developers. They really have taken to heart the city's carbon neutral 2050 goals and are already delivering buildings. So on the right here is a new office lab building that was just permitted. It's principally hybrid. It's principally an electric building with minimal natural gas for peak heating. The stats are amazing though, a 53% energy reduction and a 93% reduction in fossil fuel use. It's really exceptional. The LEED Gold, I think they're just, being a little conservative here. I think it'll be pretty close to LEED Platinum, if not LEED Platinum. Our approach here is to remain comprehensive in our sustainability strategies, but to add the zero net carbon aspects to it. So the framework that we're establishing looks at low carbon buildings. So that is, how do we make sure the building that gets built is still prioritizing on-site carbon reduction. We also want to make sure buildings include on-site renewable energy. So we're talking about introducing a mandatory renewable energy standard for buildings, and then that they have a strategy for procuring renewable energies sufficient to offset the remainder of the carbon emissions from the buildings. What was interesting in our process here was the introduction of embodied carbon and recognizing how important it is for our carbon neutral goals to also begin work on reducing embodied carbon. So more on that point to come. Right here is a good example of a city initiative. It's our E+ Green Building Program, but what we've found is multifamily residential buildings, if they're properly designed and not particularly exceptional, but if it's a good design, 4 stories of residential should be able to be energy positive. So enough PV on the roof to power the building on an annual basis. Because this is city-sponsored development, it also includes a significant amount of affordable housing. LEED Platinum is part of it as well. BU, I showed this building earlier, but this building exemplifies our performance framework, our policy framework. So first of all, it's starting out as a really good building. It's got a very low energy use intensity of 39. We are, however, working on carbon emission reduction. So all of our policy is built around carbon emission intensity. And so in this case, it's a really impressive figure of 2.9 kilograms per year. BU is adding solar renewable energy to their campus buildings, but they already have in place renewable energy procurement policies and already purchase 100% of their electricity from renewable energy resources. So this is a net zero carbon building that is already topped out in steel and well on its way to being enclosed. So once again, very fortunate to have these anchor institutions that are showing us that zero net carbon buildings are possible today. The bottom here is just the simple carbon accounting. So total emissions, on-site renewable, what's required for renewable procurement. The BU building here, by the way, is 100% electric. There is no fossil fuel use in the building. we're seeing this across typologies. So this is a large multifamily residential development project. It's actually a redevelopment of an existing affordable housing project. I think we've all heard great concerns about these sorts of policies affecting our affordable housing community. And I can tell you, this group is really at the forefront of practice. So here we have a building with an EUI below 20, which I think 2 years ago I would have said that's outrageous. It's not possible. And today I can tell you we are typically seeing buildings with EUIs below 20, multifamily residential buildings, that is. The comparable carbon emission intensity of 1.48 is exemplary. On-site renewable to offset as much as they can, and then once again the carbon calculations. This is where our work gets complex because we do have these two policies. BERDO 2.0 is brand new. The zero net carbon building zoning policy is being worked out, but they are quite similar. Our zero net carbon standard just sets an end of day zero emissions, and that's all you get for new construction buildings. Our BERDO standard is a declining standard, and I think in many regards similar to DC, and I'll show that table in just a second. Here we go. So we have different typologies. This is using the Energy Star portfolio manager typologies, but we have set declining standards based on those different uses. They step down every 5 years. And eventually by 2050, everybody zeroes out to zero emissions. Sorry for the redundancy there. I want to focus a little bit on the zero net carbon building zoning here, and in particular, the low carbon building tag, because this is where a lot of the work is, and it's really where we also place a lot of our priorities, right? We want to make sure that our new buildings are emitting as little carbon as possible. What we've been able to glean from practices in Boston is that there are really two approaches that make a lot of sense. One is a percentile reduction when compared to ASHRAE models or the Massachusetts Building Code. And then the second is to establish carbon emission intensity targets. This is where our BERDO standard and our zero net carbon standards start to align in some regards, but also create confusion. For our zero net carbon building standards, we are talking only building emissions. The net zoning requirement is annual, all emissions plus any offsets plus renewable energy procurement. But to make sure that the buildings are in fact good buildings, we've introduced this idea of building carbon emission intensity standards. And then I think another recommendation that's going to be really important for all of us is that we continue the conversation. So here, we will establish a zero net carbon advisory group to continue to update building standards and practices. So the two pathways, this first is a percentile reduction. Both are modeled. So our work and our permitting for new construction is entirely based on modeled performance. So this is fine for us to use a percentile reduction. We do know that some buildings, like a lab office building, it's going to be different from the next one. It might not be able to achieve a carbon emission intensity target, so can utilize a percentile reduction target. We also know that hospitals and energy intensive or use intensive care facilities, we're not going to see them get to a 40% reduction. So we've allowed a 30% reduction for that typology. We also know small residential buildings use HERS modeling. And so we have corresponding standards there. We also know Passive House as a overall approach does a great job of delivering low carbon buildings. So we're looking at how to utilize that as a pathway for demonstrating good practices. These are our carbon emission intensity targets. So this is a square foot per year carbon emissions. And so we have very common building typologies where we do see practices coalesce and feel very confident that we can establish these targets. I want to pause here for a quick second and just note, I'm using the word target. We're not setting these as maximums or limits or anything like that. This is what we know a good building should look like, but we also know buildings are very unique, whether it's their massing, their use, their orientation, or other aspects of that particular project. So we're going to go forward with targets that tell us that it's a good effort on the building planning side, and then make sure that the remainder of the strategy isn't overly used. The remainder of the policy framework rather being on-site renewable energy and renewable energy procurement. This just speaks to what we saw in practice when we analyzed recent projects. It shows us that many building typologies are already exceeding a 40% reduction. And so going back to things like a carbon emission intensity, we really feel like a residential multifamily buildings are, getting towards 60% reduction in carbon emissions. So we want to recognize that different typologies have different potentiality. We looked at buildings over time too, and again saw that these practices were progressing, and that we felt we could, in fact, enact these kinds of targets. And then most importantly, we wanted to look at the cost issue, and that is the big concern for everybody, that we're going to be driving up the cost of construction. And I can tell you for sure that we are seeing these buildings coming in on budget, or very close within budget, and that's without considering things like incentives or the net present value of a building that has, for instance, a very low energy cost quality to it. So I'll stop there and look forward to our conversation in the question and answer period.
Well, great. Hi, I'm Darren Port, Senior Manager, Codes and Standards at NEEP, and just want to thank everyone again for attending, and particularly to our speakers, to Harry and John and David and Katie. Fantastic information. So we only have a few minutes, unfortunately, and a bunch of questions. So I'm going to jump right in. And so I think I'll go to DC first and ask, so you're calling your initiative BEPS, BEPS, as opposed to BPS. So the natural question has arisen, are you strictly considering just energy? We see other building performance standards around the country that include water in the equation as well. So wondering your thinking, your consideration, and your title. Katie or
yeah, I feel like this is going for you.
I can answer that question. So right now, our BEPS is focused on energy efficiency and energy efficiency reduction, or energy reduction, energy efficiency reduction, energy reduction. So it's focused on efficiency first from an energy perspective. We do not incorporate any sort of water efficiency or anything into our BEPS. And we do collect water data through the Energy Star Portfolio Manager program. So people are required to submit their water consumption, but we don't have any sort of policy that regulates the efficiency of water usage.
Yeah,
currently.
Great.
Yeah, we're also doing, so we're doing a GHG study right now for the BEPS program to also evaluate carbon and how that gets incorporated in as well. So we'll see.
Yeah. Excellent.
What's in the name?
Right, what's in the name? There you go. So what about, Harry, will the federal initiative or the coalition just be considering energy, or are you going to be including water efficiency as well?
I'm not going to comment on including water. I do know that we are including both energy and emissions as opportunities to pursue your BPS. But, as I mentioned earlier, there isn't a one-size-fits-all policy approach from the federal side. We are supporting best practices and guidance and technical assistance, but it's really up to the implementing jurisdictions what they want to include as part of their performance standard.
Great, fair enough. So question arose, and I think this cuts across the board for everyone regarding smaller buildings. So Dave, I think DC was going down to 10,000 What about smaller buildings? And same for John in Boston.
Oh, well, we're excited to see the threshold go down to 20,000 square feet. When it comes to a carbon standard, smaller buildings are going to simply do better. Most are going to be fine in the performance space. So I'm kind of excited about that. I wish we could manage the workload for doing even smaller buildings. And I think that's a question for us as an industry. How do we enable smaller projects to comply with these standards? How do we make it bureaucratically manageable?
So, yeah, I can add to that from DC's perspective. We had some analysis done before our BEPS were even passed to sort of see the impact of a BEPS policy on the different sort of tranches of property sizes. And overall, if you look at sort of the modeled reduction that we're going to get in the district from implementing our BEPS policy, over 95% of that savings is going to come from buildings that are 50,000 square feet and above. So when you're talking about the biggest bang for your buck, you really need to, like, at least from DC's perspective, you really do, with a full-on BEPS policy, need to focus on those large buildings, because that's where you're going to get the most savings, particularly over time. And then the other thing, that we're sort of considering over here in DC is that, yes, our BEPS policy currently will drop down in square footage. But I've been talking a lot about, is BEPS the right tool for those smaller buildings in terms of getting reductions, and, as John mentioned, sort of the capacity for the city to really regulate that. And so I think some other tools that I would like to explore is more maybe of like a building tune-up program, retro commissioning every couple of years kind of thing, like Seattle has, and sort of exploring whether there's more appropriate ways to really be addressing the efficiency of those buildings in terms of the amount of savings you're going to get and the impact you're having on those building owners, because BEPS is a big thing. There's an economy of scale that comes with doing or having to do a retrofit, in your building. And so there's the economy of scale issues that you get into with smaller buildings, lower resource building owners, the capacity for the city to actually regulate that and ensure that it's happening. So.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Katie. John, a question regarding complexity. So you've got Berto 2.0, you've got the carbon emission intensity, and also a focus on embodied carbon. I'm wondering what sort of tools and resources is the city putting together to aid design professionals, builders, building owners, tenants for that matter, to deal with the complexity of the various policies and programs that you have in place. And I guess also if you could couch that in terms of maybe some lessons learned that Harry could then bring back to the coalition in terms of what needs to be developed nationally.
Sure, that really has been the harder part of the work. Yeah. What's guided us a lot in the beginning is to rely on our professional practitioners. So we've avoided new practices. So nothing that we're doing now around this really requires anything new. We have worked hard to establish continuity of practice around standards for carbon emission of fuel types. If you talk to any project team that cares about that, there's dozens of emission factors that are, reasonable to use, but they all produce different results. And so I think we all, and this is a great job for NEEP to, take up as part of the conversation, let's make sure we approach this with uniform standards that certainly recognize regionality. Our grid is cleaner than many others, so our carbon emissions from electricity is much lower. So how do you make sure those things are part of it? The other piece, and really where it does get confusing, is when we focus on the building emissions, that we're really talking just how the building itself performs, whereas all of our two policies are net emission standards. So they include on-site renewable, they include renewable procurement. And that, in fairness, is where folks get confused about these different standards. So how do we make sure that buildings have reasonable practice standards and that we don't create confusion around what is a net operational standard.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
No recommendations in there. Sorry. Good luck. Okay.
Well, I'm sure Harry we'll circle back to all of you, and I'm sure there'll be lots of convenings and sharing of information. And you know, I think the biggest thing that's going to be great for the coalition is that all these teams are going to meet each other. So you know, I think a lot have not met other folks. So I look forward to that. So I think Dave, you mentioned building owners accounting for BEPS and new construction. And I'm wondering if you could give some examples of what folks might be doing, or Katie, for that matter, whoever wants to answer that question, how folks are sort of future proofing or future thinking through their new construction, understanding where they're headed. And I'll ask you to keep your response to just a minute, because unfortunately we're going to have to wrap up.
So yeah, this is a part that we're actively working on now to think about how to guide our new codes. But I mean, in a simple way, you could take the BEPS as a design target, you know, an energy design target, and do it that way, and then build in a buffer and so forth. We built in, I mentioned the qualified allocation plan for the low-income housing tax credit, which is like how affordable housing is financed in most places. And so within that, there's requirements to address and meet the BEP standards as a requirement for receiving funding, as like a mandatory requirement. So there's some places that we've kind of aligned these things, but it is sort of an active area. And as mentioned, like things are ramping up at different rates, and there are two different agencies and historically two different like sets of regulations and policies and laws. So that's like, yeah, it's an important piece, but I don't know, Katie, if you have anything else to add.
Darren, I think the big takeaway for me in those comments is that projects have a carbon or energy budget or program that they're working on. It's just like the use, the square footage, the occupancy. What's your carbon program? How are you managing that? And that they start their project with that goal in mind.
Yeah. You could even, you know, one of the challenges we have is like multi-cycle compliance, you know, so like 1 cycle versus 2 versus 3 and 4 is sort of an unpredictable amount at the moment. So yeah, it's tricky, but I agree, John.
Great. Well, we've reached our time. Unfortunately, this is fantastic. I wish we had more time for conversation and getting deeper into all this. I'd just like to remind folks, March 22nd is our next Ready, Set, Scale on community representation, community that centers equity. And again, on behalf of our sponsors and state partners, a thank you to Dave and Katie, Harry, and John. Look forward to continue to working with you in this space and all things codes and standards and getting to zero. And we'll see you all again very soon. Thanks again, and thanks to all our participants today and attendees. Take care.
You're welcome.
Yep. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much.